Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is actually going to be helping me out today, so we can give you a little bit more variety. Everyone say hi!
Number 10. The Butcher Baker. Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker, was one of the most despicable villains the FBI ever tangled with. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, Robert turned the wild woods of Alaska into his own personal playground. He abducted adult entertainers and exotic dancers, and would then let them loose in the remote wilderness, after which he'd proceed to hunt them like animals. His life growing up had been pretty miserable, which makes it easier to understand why he was the way he was. He was a social outcast who grew up paranoid that everyone was out to get him. He burned down a school bus garage in 1960, spent a couple of years in jail, and then fled the contiguous United States in 1967. He subsequently joined a small community in Alaska and opened up a bakery. He was arrested multiple times for assaulting and abducting women, but he always made bail and was released. Then in 1973, he started kidnapping people and hunted them down in the woods. In 1983, over a decade after he'd moved to Alaska, a woman named Cindy Paulson escaped his wicked game. He'd kidnapped the 18-year-old girl and tortured her at his house. Then he prepared to load her into his plane and take her out to his cabin where he would hunt her. However, as he was preparing the plane, Cindy escaped and ran off. After she told her story to the police, the FBI got involved. FBI agent John Douglas put together a psychological profile of the killer, which eventually led them to Robert Hansen, who confessed to murdering 17 women over 12 years. As a punishment for his horrific actions, he was given 461 years in prison. He served his time at the Spring Creek Correctional Center, located in Seward, Alaska, where he passed away in 2014. Number 9. The Alcatraz Escapees. The U.S. Marshals Service recently released updated renderings of 3 fugitives who escaped Alcatraz on June 11, 1962. These new renderings show what the escapees would look like if they were still alive today, even though they'd be in their 90s by now. The FBI has been looking into the case for over 40 years, and still there's no real hope of ever tracking down the 3 men who managed to break out of Alcatraz. These criminals are Frank Morris, John Anglin, and John's brother, Clarence Anglin. All 3 of them created fake heads to make it look like they were still sleeping and tunneled through the solid concrete walls of their cells. They then escaped Alcatraz Island and paddled away into the night on a raft made from prison raincoats. They were the only men to ever successfully escape Alcatraz without getting caught. These days, their escape is one of the FBI's biggest failures. Countless tips regarding the missing men have come in over the past 60 years. A raft was allegedly discovered after the escape, and 3 men were spotted stealing a car that same night. But even with all the information and tips, the FBI never managed to track them down. The Anglin brothers were supposedly photographed at a bar in Brazil in 1975, but that was the closest anyone ever came to seeing the 3 fugitives alive. Number 8. John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of the first criminals ever hunted by the FBI. His infamy began on May 10, 1933, after he'd just finished serving nearly 9 years in prison and immediately went to rob a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. John was arrested by Dayton police on September 22nd and was subsequently booked into the county jail in Lima, where he'd wait for his trial. Days later, 8 of John's pals broke out of the Indiana State Prison and killed 2 guards in the process before showing up at the Lima jail. They shot the sheriff and beat him to death, and then they stole the keys to John's cell in order to free him. From there, the crew went on an insane spree of terror that lasted until July of 1934. They killed 10 men, robbed multiple banks, and staged a total of 3 jailbreaks. The crew only got busted on January 23, 1934 because a fire started at the hotel they were staying at. Firemen recognized the criminals from their photographs, and John Dillinger was arrested, and so too were 3 other men in his gang. John was taken to the county jail in Crown Point, Indiana, but apparently no cell could hold him, and he once again broke free and ran away, forcing the FBI to get involved. The FBI launched a manhunt as John continued robbing banks throughout the country. There were multiple shootouts between the criminal and law enforcement, but John got away every time. It wasn't until July 22, 1934 that they finally cornered him. John was sold out by a madam of a brothel named Anna Campanas. Anna was in the middle of being deported back to Romania and was willing to trade information in order to stay in the US. She told the FBI exactly where to find John, and the agents cornered him as he left a movie theater in Chicago. They tried to take him peacefully, but John pulled out a pistol and started shooting. 3 FBI agents shot him though, and he fell to the pavement and bled to death. Number 7. The Unabomber. On May 25, 1978, a package that was delivered to the Northwestern University of Evanston, Illinois, exploded. Over the next 17 years, 15 more bombings would occur in the United States of America. 3 people were killed, and many others were injured as the FBI tried desperately to track down a man known only as the Unabomber. It was in 1995 that FBI criminal profiler James R. Fitzgerald started working on the case. The FBI at the time considered the Unabomber a criminal mastermind, someone who went through great lengths not to get caught. He ripped the skin off batteries so they couldn't be traced, and he even made his own glue by melting down deer hooves. He also never left any trace of DNA or fingerprints. The Unabomber started sending letters to the media and to his victims in the early 1990s. Then in 1995, he sent his manifesto to the biggest papers in the country. His view was that society should be erased, technology should stop, and people should go back to living in tribes made up of hunters and gatherers. Fitzgerald used the manifesto to help build a profile that ultimately led them to Ted Kaczynski in 1996. Fitzgerald was able to get into Kaczynski's head and realized he was likely a loner, someone who lived in isolation far from civilization. They eventually tracked Ted Kaczynski to a cabin in Montana where he was living as a hermit. Kaczynski pleaded guilty to the bombings in 1998 and was sentenced to life in prison as a result. And now for number 6, but first it's shout-out time. We wanted to give a big thank you to Leanna, Ellie and Scorpion for supporting this channel. We love your feedback. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join the family. Number 6. Durkin. The first FBI agent ever killed in the line of duty was Edwin C. Shanahan, who was shot dead on October 11, 1925. Special Agent Shanahan was killed as he was trying to apprehend the automobile thief Martin James Durkin. Durkin already had an extensive criminal record. He previously shot 3 policemen in Chicago and a 4th officer in California. He had a reputation as a desperate gunman who would kill any authority who tried to stop him. Edwin Shanahan received information that Durkin was expected at a garage in Chicago with a stolen automobile that he'd brought up from New Mexico. The agent and local police descended on the garage and waited for Durkin. However, after many hours passed, they decided the information was bogus. The officers left, but Shanahan remained fixed on the garage, hoping that at some point Durkin would show up. And he did, but not until all the officers had left. Shanahan tried to take on Durkin by himself, but was shot straight to the chest with a revolver. This resulted in a cross-country manhunt. The FBI had lost one of their own, and they were absolutely furious. They finally managed to track Durkin to the railroad, but he'd already boarded Southern Pacific train number 110, bound for St. Louis, Missouri. Special agents with the FBI learned he was in the stateroom car with a mysterious woman and would be arriving at 11 in the morning. So the FBI had the train stopped just outside a small town before it could reach the city. That way the murderer had nowhere to run if he escaped. The train was surrounded, and Durkin was eventually dragged out of the stateroom. The criminal was then handcuffed before he could even reach for his gun. Durkin went to jail in 1926 but was released in 1954 at the age of 53. He passed away 27 years later in 1981. Number 5. James Eddie Diggs. James Eddie Diggs was allegedly a normal, happy, regular kind of guy. He worked as a mechanic at a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a family man who was a respected member of his community, and his neighbors described him as a hard-working individual. And yet, at 7 a.m. on May 26, 1949, James shot his wife Ruth and murdered their 2 young sons, James Jr. and Alfonso. After the unprovoked killings, James went on the run. On May 31st, he was identified in North Carolina, where he was pulled over by law enforcement. He then shot Officer Rex Howell, critically wounding him, and then vanished without a trace. That was the last time James was ever seen, and to this day he remains on the most wanted list of the FBI. But even all these years later, nobody knows why James suddenly killed his family, or what his motivation may have been. He's been on the run for over 70 years, and at this point, he's likely already dead. What do you think caused James Eddie Diggs to kill his wife and children? Let us know in the comments. Number 4. Eduardo Ravello. Eduardo Ravello was once on the FBI's most wanted list. He's a Mexican-American gangster who used to be the head of the Barrio Ateca gang. He earned the position of gang leader by betraying his old boss. In 2008, he shot the leader of the gang in the neck and stabbed him several times. Eduardo then took over the group, and these weren't the kind of people you'd want to mess around with. They allegedly operated as hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels. There are about 600 active members of the gang that still murder, extort, kidnap, and participate in every other crime you can think of. The gang members are also prevalent in many prisons across America and Mexico. In 2017, the FBI was seeking help in capturing Eduardo. They offered $100,000 for any information that would lead to an arrest. They were desperate for help because Eduardo was wanted in connection to murdering a pregnant U.S. consulate employee, her husband, and the husband of another consulate worker. Leslie Enriquez was 4 months pregnant when she was shot to death on March 13, 2010. Her husband Arthur was also killed, along with Jorge Alberto Salcido Ceniceros. The murders were performed at the behest of Eduardo. Thankfully, the FBI announced that the gangster was captured in June of 2018, following a police raid in Mexico. So far as we know, he's still behind bars. Number 3. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph was born in Merritt Island, Florida, on September 19, 1966. He served briefly in the U.S. Army, then worked as a carpenter. But he later went on to become a murderer. He was responsible for the devastating bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. On July 27th, Eric detonated a 40-pound, 18-kilogram pipe bomb at the Centennial Olympic Park. 2 people were killed as a result, and over 100 others were injured. This was only the start of Eric's killing spree. On January 16, 1997, a pair of bombs went off at a clinic that performed abortions, subsequently wounding 7 people. The month after, a bomb exploded at a nightclub in Atlanta, injuring 4 people. Then, on January 29, 1998, a woman's health clinic in Birmingham, Alabama was targeted. A bomb blew up, killing 1 security guard and critically injuring a nurse. It took 4 bombings for the FBI to finally identify Eric Rudolph as their main suspect, and it was only because somebody spotted his pickup truck near the clinic right before the bomb exploded. Authorities launched a manhunt, but Eric was nowhere to be found. He remained on the FBI's most wanted list from between 1998 and 2003. And in the end, he wasn't even caught by the FBI. A rookie police officer ended up discovering Eric digging through a dumpster in the town of Murphy, North Carolina. All that time on the run had depleted Eric's funds, and he was starving. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 4 life terms and is currently at the Supermax Federal Prison in Florence. Number 2. Michael Tavis. Michael Tavis made a fortune in the 1970s through peep show machines. They called him the Sultan of Smut, and for good reason. Michael boasted that 99% of the adult magazines and films sold in America moved through his warehouse. He also had his own factory in Atlanta, in which he manufactured a revolutionary new machine. It was kind of like a jukebox, but for risque content. It was an 8mm projector that played erotic films on a 15-second loop. Michael leased these machines to adult bookstores, where they went into private booths and were fed quarters by millions of men who had no access to the internet. The invention apparently made Michael an estimated $2 billion. However, Michael had some competition from a man named Kenneth Hanna, so Michael invited Kenneth to his warehouse to talk about business opportunities. Once they were there, he pulled out a pistol and shot Kenneth 3 times in the chest. Somehow Kenneth survived this attempt on his life, forcing Michael to shoot him execution style. This was all because Michael had heard that Kenneth was ripping off his idea and was trying to profit off of his smut machines. Michael got away with the killing until 1978, when he was snitched on by a former employee. He was charged with murder, but he managed to escape from his jail cell in New Albany, Indiana later that same year. He went on the run, but was tracked down by the FBI. They apprehended him a few months later in November while he was attempting to take cash out of a bank under a fake identity in Connecticut. Number 1. Billy Bryant. In April of 1968, Billy Bryant was sentenced to 54 years in prison for bank robbery and assault. By August of that same year, he'd escaped his incarceration at the Corrections Reformatory in Lawton, Virginia, and was on the run. Billy stole a vehicle he'd been working on at the automobile shop inside the reformatory, then drove it through a chain-link gate and took off. The FBI immediately tried to track Billy down. However, things didn't go the way they should have. Billy robbed a bank on January 8, 1969, but FBI agents caught up to Billy at his wife's house not far from the bank he'd just robbed. When they knocked on the door, Billy shot all 3 agents at point-blank range and then slammed the door shut. One of the agents survived the brutal attack, but Edwin R. Woodruff and Anthony Palmisano were pronounced dead upon their arrival at the hospital. Agents and police surrounded the house, but Billy was long gone. He'd scrambled out an upper window and escaped down a tree. The police then received a call from a concerned citizen that somebody was in their attic. It turned out Billy had broken into someone else's house and barricaded himself in their attic, thinking he could wait out the police there. However, the homeowner heard all the racket and called the police. The FBI showed up, and Billy Bryant was then dragged back to jail. He was only on the FBI's most wanted list for 2 hours before being caught. Which of the FBI's most terrifying criminals do you think was the worst? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.